Well, welcome back to another episode of Adventure Management Pod with me, Pete Tupper. Today, the topic is the power of narratives in outdoor programming. And this is a topic that I'll be doing a little speech on at an upcoming conference called Off-Seas, which is the outdoor forum for Southeast Asian schools. So anyone who will be at that event, look forward to seeing you there. And so what this topic is all about is really how we can recognize that narratives and stories are such a powerful force, well, in life in general and in all kinds of art forms, but especially in our field of outdoor programming. So when we're putting together itineraries, activities, anything in the outdoor adventure industry, having an element of a narrative in there can be extremely useful, powerful. It can make the experience much more memorable and engaging for the participants. This week, the guest is Ollie Stewart. Ollie and I go way back. We actually have been running a company together for a long time now, and that's Imagine Taiwan. I chose Ollie as the guest this week because we've gone through so many of these narratives actually together, both in terms of the activities, the itineraries we put together, and we've had a lot of discussions together about this topic actually when we've been thinking about the activities that we want to give to our guests. And Ollie has been designing all kinds of experiences in Taiwan, quite often with a strong emphasis on the narrative. So without further ado, let's welcome Ollie.
Hello, Pete. Thank you.
Ollie.
Is that your jingle?
Yes,
is that your intro jingle?
That is my intro jingle.
Okay. Well, whenever you sound the trumpet, I'll realize you're transitioning to a break.
Exactly.
All right.
Ollie, welcome to the show.
Hello, Pete. Thank you very much for having me on board. Great to be here.
So when it comes to narratives in outdoor programming, what are some of the key things that you think about when let's say you are designing a new itinerary? Maybe we get an inquiry from a school who says, I want to give my students an amazing experience in Taiwan. What can you do for us? What is your thought process in terms of the narrative element of putting together an itinerary for them?
Yeah, good question. Different for adults, different for kids, and I think it depends school to school and what their specific learning outcomes are. Some schools are very interested in theory. Other schools are very interested in hands-on approaches, experiential learning, activities. So I think you've got to take into account what exactly the schools are looking for. And then you can think about the learning outcomes of the trip. So depending on where they'll be going and the kind of activities you'll be doing, then you'll have a better idea of what narratives you might be able to weave into that school trip. So I think it very much depends on the school and the learning outcomes.
Cool. So what is a narrative exactly in your understanding?
Yeah, what is a narrative? So I would say a narrative is essentially a story that you can use, that you can kind of print over the experience, and it ties together all of the different elements of the trip. I think narratives and stories are very core to the human psyche.
Yeah.
The story behind it brings what you're talking about or the lessons that you want to impart. They just bring it to life.
Yeah. And you've read *Sapiens* by Yuval Noah Harari, right?
Yeah, quite a while ago, but yes, brilliant book. Really, really moved the dial.
Because I remember, I think he's one of the real powerful voices on this topic at the moment in terms of what narratives are and why they are so powerful to human beings. And he goes back to, our origins in the wild and how having stories was a powerful way that we could develop as a species because we were able to transfer knowledge to each other about, for example, what happened to the other tribe member the other week, or, even stories about myths and legends and all these kind of things that bring groups together. And he sort of emphasizes how that is the reason why we, even to this day, relate to stories so much. When we hear a story, we immediately engage with it, we listen to it, and it helps us to remember things. So with that in mind, what examples can you think of when you've noticed that story element is really what has kind of made a student or a participant really sort of engage with the activity in that moment in a way that they may not have if it was just simply a bunch of activities pasted together with no thought behind it?
Yeah, I mean, we've definitely seen a huge amount of engagement with the Civilization game. Would it be worth explaining from your perspective what the Civilization game is about before I launch into that?
Okay, yeah, sure. So the what the Civilization game is all about is basically we wanted to impart some survival skills and classic kind of outdoor skills in the forest, and we were thinking, how can we make this more engaging instead of saying, okay, now you've got to start a fire. Okay, now you've got to learn how to use a knife. Okay, now you're going to build something. Instead of just giving them those individual tasks and things to learn, we created a narrative to link it all together so that from the very beginning, what they do is they arrive in the forest and they are told that they now have a mission to not only survive in this forest, but also thrive as a civilization, build their own little village and work together as a tribe and figure out how they're going to organize themselves as the tribe, how they're going to make decisions, how they're going to go about the challenges and what kind of culture they might also develop in their tribe or in their civilization. And what we found is that this really helps the students to stay engaged in that narrative for the whole time. And it can go on for 5 days. Usually it's about 3 days. And whenever they come back to the base, back to the forest, they get straight back into what they were doing because they know how it all fits together. They go, oh, yeah, we still need to make our throne for the king, or we still need to finish painting the legend on the rock using the charcoal because it all fits together. That's the key. And
Yeah,
it's a shared narrative, a shared story that
yeah.
they're all living together. They're all experiencing that one story.
This is the big difference between the Civilization game and hang on a minute, we've got on a bus, we've left the classroom, we're suddenly in this forest setting,
Yeah.
and what we're doing.
Yeah.
Um,
It's an
I
adventure.
think it's an adventure. Yeah, it's always a joy to be planning and preparing those trips. And then
And
when you
it's
actually get out there with the kids and see all of the different creative ways they interpret that story, it's an amazing thing.
Yeah, and I think even the word adventure, it used to mean, an adventure always had a beginning, a middle, and an end, right? You think about the Lord of the Rings
Mm.
or any of these epic tales, any epic stories of adventure. They start somewhere, they do something, and then there's all these ups and downs and dramas and events along the way, and then there's a nice kind of conclusion or ending to the story. When you think about some outdoor activities that happen these days, they call it adventure, but actually it's done in a kind of robotic way. It's like, okay, now you've got to
Mm.
climb up that wall. Now you've got to fire that
Yeah.
bow and arrow. And now you've got to jump in that kayak and just paddle around a bit and then come back to shore. And next
Yeah,
it's
why?
like, yeah. And then it's like group
What?
D, now you are rotating around to this station at 1 p.m. And then it's like,
Mm.
is that an adventure? Is that,
Yeah, it's a bit mechanic, isn't it? It's a bit automated.
yeah,
I think also the minds of kids, especially kids, also adults, but specifically for kids, is their minds are a bit more abstract. They understand stories a little bit better, and they really get into role play. I mean, it's
yeah,
just play. All mammals, grow up and they learn to play before they, go out and learn to hunt or anything like that. And that play element to it where they can get inside a bit of a character or a story that they want to enact
yeah.
just makes it much more of an experience for them.
Exactly. I remember in the really early days of Imagine, one of the quite funny and popular camps that we did was called Night School. And it was, again, linking a load of activities together with a narrative. And the narrative was becoming a knight, becoming a medieval knight.
Mm.
And so they were doing, firing bows and arrows. They were riding horses, building a trebuchet, painting a shield design, doing all kinds of activity. Each of those activities in itself would have been something, but by having it all linked together as one story from the beginning to the end, your mission is to become a knight
Mhm.
by the end of this
Yeah,
week. They
yeah. And
loved
how
it.
much do the guides, the facilitators, have to set the scene for that story? And how much did the kids just pick it up and go with it?
Exactly. They often just pick it up and go with it because they're living the story. They're in that character and it's just natural for them. In the end, the climax at the end was like a fight with a dragon where they had an instructor in a big dragon suit and the kids were like in the grounds of like a building that looked like a castle. They had to throw these fireballs at the dragon. And no, sorry, the dragon was throwing the fireballs at the kids and in a safe way. And the kids had like an inflate.
Actual fire.
They're like little yellow rubber balls, and the kids had inflatable swords and shields, and they had to like block the fireballs and bash them away and stuff, and then try to like hit the dragon with their swords and shields, and then slay the dragon. And when they slayed the dragon, that was like the end of the camp, and they could then become a knight officially, and then they got knighted. And imagine being a kid in that moment. You're genuinely becoming a knight in that moment. You're like, hell yeah. I know why we're doing this. I know why I want to stay engaged with this. I'm going to see it through to the end, and I'm going to complete this.
I'm going to kill that dragon instructor.
I'm going to kill that dragon.
I hope they're still with us.
Yeah. And so that's an example, of how it really just helps to make the participants understand the context of why they're doing the activities.
Yeah, and I think the facilitation is the key to it. You're not enforcing the laws on the kids. You're giving them an opportunity to be creative and, experiment with their ideas, try what they're doing, fail, try a different thing. And everyone's different. Some students will want to do one thing and other students will be obsessed with another thing. I think you referenced it earlier when you were talking about the Civilization game. But so at the beginning of the Civilization game, you have a little discussion where you set the scene. But what's quite fun is to have the two teams before decide, what is a civilization, and how they define that themselves will very much determine what they do. Yeah, letting them define what that is great fun.
Exactly.
And then you can go into all sorts of, how do civilizations run? How do we get things done? And then the students will have to think about, how do we decide as a group what we want to do, what we want to make? And I remember one particular group, there was one kid he wasn't even that dominating, but he became the dictator. So the whole day became about building him a massive throne that you could transport him in, and they'd have the rest of the team keeping him cool with big banana leaves, and I've never seen anything like that before. Meanwhile, the other groups are busy constructing really complicated shelters and trying to create irrigation systems, and they've got a democratic system going on, and this dictator group's having lots of fun. They've built a mobile contraption and they're just exploring. Great.
It's interesting how you mentioned he was not a particularly dominant kid in the beginning, and that actually reminds me of a story on a Civilization game where we had a student who was actually really like shy and really almost being bullied and ousted by her classmates in the beginning and almost didn't say a word. And at that time they had a leader in their tribe that was going a bit corrupt, and the leader was it's just like a classic kind of story really of how when someone's got too much power they just become corrupt. So he was like getting all his classmates to do stuff for him and go and get him, like, I don't know, steal chocolate from the other groups for him and stuff like that. He was basically becoming a corrupt dictator. And this girl at one point, she kind of whispered to one of the instructors and said, I'd like to have a go at being the leader. Do you think I could try? And we said, well, why don't you put it to your team, see what they think? So we put it to a vote to the team, and the team decided they would like to let her have a go at it because they were sick of their corrupt dictator. And she just took to it like what's the expression?
Duck to water.
Duck to water. She was a natural leader, and she'd probably never had the opportunity to discover that before. From the moment she sat on that throne, she was like, right, what we've got to do is this and this and this, and we're going to have a head of you're going to have a head of engineering. That can be you, Tom, and then we need a head of
so that was
trade.
a proper end to the tyranny.
Yeah, and she started delegating things to like leaders of each department, things that needed to be getting done, and within half an hour everyone was to work building stuff and trading things, and the civilization was flourishing. And
how did the corrupt official take that?
I can't remember. I think
did he go down with a fight?
I think he actually got kicked out. I think the rest of the group decided he had to get out, so that he was like in exile or something. He had to go to the other tribes. So the really kind of magical part of that story, and again, that was a story, and hopefully because it was a story, that's what makes it, interesting to hear. But the final end to that story was that she then became so confident as a result of that. And all the teachers, the school teachers were like, oh my God, I've never seen this student like this before. She was, her shoulders were back. She was walking tall. She was really proud of how she had become a leader. And that really illustrates how a story can actually be the story of a person, actually, the story of a person's character developing. And you can often see that in any kind of outdoor activities. I think this is something we all love about doing what we do, is that you see how people develop, and they may come to the camp or the trip in one way, and then by the end of it, they've transformed, and that in itself is a story that you can celebrate and emphasize.
Yeah, and it's the fact that it's in such a radically different environment to the classroom, where you have rules. This is what you should be doing. Now you open your textbooks. Now you listen to the teacher. Then you put your hand up. In this different, school trip setting, they have much more freedom to do what they want. And that's when some students will end up really shining. They'll try and do things that they wouldn't normally do. You'll have some kids that would focus on art and creating something beautiful. We've had some Japanese Zen stone gardens crop up in the middle of our civilizations, complete with a river that's, flowing into it, and other quite incredible designs being made. And then you've got, some other kids that just want to sit in a hammock and look up at the trees and swing around. And you know what? That's absolutely fine. We're not going to stop them from doing that.
Exactly.
If that's what they want to do, then, go for it. Enjoy yourself.
So you mentioned a river flowing, and I think that would be a good way to flow into another little subtopic, which is how a narrative, when you think about it, can also be the narrative of, for example, how water flows from the spring at the source into the river and all the way to the ocean. And I remember that was something that you integrated into one of the itineraries in Taiwan that ended up being really popular. So it was like following the water from the spring on day one up in the mountains.
Oh, yeah.
And then we did rafting, I think, probably, or river tracing. Yeah, river tracing. And then
that was an amazing trip. That was really, really good fun. That was, school visiting Taiwan from overseas, and an amazing group of teachers and really epic group of students. We went on this, wild adventure all over the place, but we wanted them to feel like there was some sort of direction to the trip. So when we started off in the mountains with the Taya tribe, learning some survival skills, and then we went down to go and do some river tracing. And then we went on to go and do some SUP or kayaking. I think it was kayaking on the river. And then we wound up on the beach did we do a treasure hunt in the end? I think they had to find something on the beach, which was the goal at the end of the trip.
Which in itself is also an awesome type of narrative, isn't it? Searching for something and finding it. So there was that running theme of like following the water down from the mountains. I think that's so cool. It's like, a story doesn't have to always be about people or about drama or anything. It can also be the story of, in this case, water, where it starts, where it then goes, and where it ends up. And that really helped the students to gain awareness of how water flows in the world as well. It's not just there. It's not just there in the ocean. It's not just there in the river. It's come from somewhere and it's going somewhere.
Yeah, it's not that complicated, is it? It's just a simple little idea that you share with a group that actually just
they may not have thought
brings
about.
It all together.
Yeah.
No. And then within that, there's a whole bunch of sub-stories in the different locations. We had the treasure hunt at the beach, but actually within the Taya tribe, the stories that they were telling them a lot of stories about their culture and how they hunt and what the animals mean to them and things like that. And I think that's something that is quite profound that you can share with kids, is, that when you come into contact with some of these ideas from indigenous people who spend a lot of time with the land, they don't look at the forest, they read it like a book. They'll look for clues in it. They'll see various things in the landscape, whether it's footprints or droppings or, how the birds are flying, give some clues to where water is and all sorts of things like that.
You know what's really cool is actually that I caught up with that teacher who was on that trip the other day, and she still remembered that trip because of the element of the narrative of following the water down from the mountains to the ocean. She mentioned it just
Oh,
like,
really?
yeah, just spontaneously. She said, "Oh, I really remember that was such a special trip because it had that element that, tied it all together, that it was following the water down. It's such a, unique kind of special element to it that really helped her to remember that trip and hopefully the students as well."
That's nice to hear. Yeah, I guess never really think about it like that, but memory, like actually, how do you remember things? You're much more likely to remember a good story than
Exactly.
just an individual experience, aren't you?
Exactly. And, we want students to remember what they've done and what they've learned because it is education, and anything that helps them to remember it. That's good. That's a job well done. Stories also are used for memory techniques, aren't they? I think when you read about like how memory athletes remember crazy long sequences of numbers, they create a story with
Yeah, the
those.
Mind Palace.
Yeah. Do you remember we actually had to do that to remember our bank number or whatever it was in Taiwan?
Yeah, I
In
don't think it's appropriate to mention that one on
Yeah.
here for many reasons, is it?
So we had to remember our unique company code or something, and made up a story with what the
The
numbers
tax
sounded
number.
like. Yeah, some boring number, and the story was obviously really explicit, and that kind of really helps to help you remember things if stories are dramatic, explicit, emotional, or anything like that. So having a little bit of drama, maybe not explicit things when it's students, but anything that's kind of a little bit like
Gross
uh
things, strange things, shocking
yeah,
things,
yeah.
anything that just
Have you
triggers
ever
surprise.
Yeah. Have you ever noticed how at the end of a long camp or a long trip, sometimes when the kids get back to their parents and they say, "Oh, how was the trip?" And the first thing they say is just one memorable, dramatic or, gross or something moment like, "Oh, this person stood in a dog poo and it went all over their shoes," or something. That's the one thing that they remember. So having an
Yeah,
element.
Jimmy nearly cut his arm off. No, that hasn't happened.
Yeah, there was blood everywhere. No, but they like to. There's not usually blood everywhere. Just to be clear about that. Um,
Usually,
something
not
dramatic,
usually.
something
Just a little
dramatic.
footnote.
Yeah, sometimes dog poo. Sometimes dog poo everywhere. So
Yeah.
something that is dramatic, or something that stands out in the story as
Yeah,
kind of.
or just a cracking real story. There was another trip we did in Taidong. That's where the Amis tribe and the Paiwan tribe
Yeah,
mostly reside.
yeah,
And the story about that, I mean, for a lot of Taiwanese kids, they don't spend too much time thinking about the history of Taiwan and understanding who the Aboriginal people are, where they came from, and where they went, which was the key theme to one of our trips. I think it was the Paiwanese tribe. They are actually the origin of all of Austro-Polynesian. So
yeah,
from as far as Madagascar all the way to New Zealand and all of the, Malaysia and the different islands in between, it's a very compelling theory of the movement of mankind that they all originated from Taiwan, from that one tribe. I also heard an anecdote from someone in the Sarawak tribe saying they went to go visit somewhere in Malaysia or Papua New Guinea or something, but then the kids were able to communicate a little bit in their native tongue, which is
wow,
wild considering how far away it is. So, that's a fascinating story just to think that actually 3,500 years ago, there was this tribe in Taiwan that decided to get really, really good at sailing. And they went on some epic journeys all over the Pacific.
yeah,
And just, it really brought alive the reality of what those people back then would have had to have been capable of, building boats,
yeah,
storing food, navigating, all of these really impressive skills, looking up at the stars and working out which way to go. And then, all of those points are really good experiential learning points. So you can build that into a trip. And we had a school come over, join the tribe, and over the course of 3 days, they went into the forests with the tribe. They learnt about the respect for the forest and their traditions around cutting down bamboo and asking the the spirits or the ancestors, how much to take, and then actually building rafts and making the boats and thinking about that journey as a way to do those, they're cooking, they're building, they're thinking about survival theory, and that's why they're doing it.
Yeah,
It's
so
dynamic.
you're creating a real context. So you're putting the activities that they are doing as students into the context of what humankind has done, or what, how this fits into the origin of humankind. And yeah, that's awesome. So they can
Yeah,
really understand when they're doing that, when they're building their boat, they're thinking like, oh, someone did this 3,000 years ago and we're doing the same thing. And this is why it's relevant. This is why it's like makes sense to be doing this. And
yeah, I definitely wouldn't trust getting on one of those boats and popping off to New Zealand on it from Taiwan.
yeah, it makes you really appreciate
Yeah,
how many skills people had in the past that have just been completely lost, and how when we
yeah,
now try to learn those skills, we can feel humbled by just how difficult it is. And we can also understand when we're doing, maybe we're learning about navigation using the stars, and again, we're thinking, this is something that people actually used to do in this part of the world. And this is how they then managed to navigate to Madagascar and all these other places. And it's just suddenly it all makes sense. It's not just something
mm,
a teacher is telling you to learn about.
yeah. No, you do. I do feel, there is a deep sense of loss in terms of all of that knowledge and understanding of things. That I think actually, particularly in Taiwan, there's such strong and vibrant indigenous culture that, a lot of that knowledge hasn't been lost. And there's still a lot of people that understand aspects of the flora and fauna and survival. But I think in a lot of very industrialized nations that are all focused around, urban areas and things like that, that knowledge is kind of disappeared.
Yeah. So picking up on the historical element of that, stories in history can be used to form the backbone of a narrative of a trip as well. So an example might be if you're visiting an old historical town somewhere, you don't only visit it and learn about it, but you walk in the footsteps of a certain character. So you are told a story of what happened to that character in that place, and your whole itinerary can be based around that. So these are the footsteps that this character walked in. These are the challenges that they came across, and then this is why we're going to do this activity to do the same thing that that character did in that story. And then by following the
Mm.
footsteps of a historical character, you're not only learning about the history, but you're also, again, using that narrative to make the whole experience itself make more sense.
Yeah.
We've talked a lot about students, but adults, of course, shouldn't be starved of narrative-based experiences. So can you think of any examples of narrative-based activities, trips, experiences that have worked well with adults in your experience?
Yeah, corporate team building events are amazing opportunities for adults to get abstract and think about how they can, use their imaginations a little bit more outside the context of the challenge of earning money or whatever the projects that they're working on. And yeah, in Taipei, we've run a lot of scavenger hunts, which is just a lovely way to explore. You've got a guide that is, taking them around the city, a few different teams. Usually, they'll have a morning of meetings, and then in the afternoon they'll be really excited to get out and go and see what's going on. And then you have the added dynamic of having a challenge in there. So you really see a lot of these corporate groups that are quite impressive, quite well organized, and genuinely talented and very good at what they're doing. And when you give them a challenge, they will think so carefully about how they can win. And, obviously they'll cheat and, twist the rules and try and work out ways of getting the points for the various challenges. But it's amazing how much people really get into that. And then,
Yeah,
yeah, there's a real laugh at the end of the day when, you have a presentation to show, tell stories from the day. And that's the key, really. When things go wrong or when random things happen or people didn't like things or something like that, those little moments, the highs and lows and the experience, they just turn into stories.
yeah,
And they're probably the things that they take back home or take back to the
yeah,
office or are
yeah,
telling later on.
yeah. Exactly, yeah. And as you mentioned, like that motivation factor, the way that because there's a story to the whole thing, there's a mission that keeps them all engaged, right? They're like, right, we're going to win this, and we're in this. We're gonna actually see this through, and we're gonna do our best to complete this whole challenge. Whereas if it was more just like, okay, now you have to do this task. Okay, well done. Now you have to do this task. They'll be like, why? And they won't really care.
Yeah,
But if you say,
yeah,
okay, this is all about it's a scavenger hunt, you've got a time limit, you've got to beat your other teams, and your time starts now, then it's like, okay, we've got a mission for the day. And
yeah.
we
And
yeah,
those missions are quite multidimensional. They're not just two teams playing against each other trying to kick a ball in a goal. How many points do you get? There's all sorts of different ways you can interpret that and different journeys that you can go on, aren't there?
yeah, awesome. And just briefly, a couple of other last types of narratives that I think are worth touching on is just simple A to B journey, like literally a journey from A to B. For example, Duke of Edinburgh Adventurous Journeys, right? Anywhere where it's quite a simple mission, but it's a very clear mission with a story behind it. The narrative is we are going to get from point A to point B, and that's our challenge. We've got to hike over these mountains, cross these rivers, carry our food with us, all that kind of stuff. So it's quite a simple one, but shouldn't be forgotten
Yeah.
that
I
it
th-
is a form of narrative.
It's a really nice structure, the Duke of Edinburgh. And that's something that I've noticed in the difference in approach to experiential learning and school trips and the development of kids' core skills outside the classroom. In the classroom, you'd have a curriculum and you'd have a sense of progression and development. But then when you go on trips, it's really important that the kids at a certain age start at a certain level that builds their confidence rather than intimidates them and makes them, not like nature or not like the outdoors. And if there was one thing that I would like to see different schools in Asia adopting a little bit more is the idea of progressive school trips, progressive learning journeys.
Yeah.
Starting off simple, might even be a day trip, very simple, and you'd start at the age 6, 7, 8 to do something like that. Then it might progress to an overnight camping trip where they would be spending the first night away from home and camping in a very safe campsite area mixed with a few other activities. And ultimately, you would like teenagers to be thinking by themselves about, going on an expedition of some sort, thinking about what they are going to pack, and they would feel confident taking themselves off on an adventure and being safe because they've made all the planning and preparation to do it. And, above all, that's a way for them to enjoy themselves in the future that they can have for free. And I think, sometimes where that goes wrong is that the first trip that they might go on might be a bit intimidating or something like that, and they end up not enjoying it and associating that with, a negative experience rather than having incremental positive experiences so they develop confidence and skills as they get older.
Yeah. And progression itself can be a great narrative, right? That can be the narrative of, like, for example, a ski trip. The narrative there really is we're learning how to ski, or we're improving our skiing from day 1 through to day 5. And by the end of the week, we've improved our skills, and that is a journey in itself. So it's really interesting when you really start to recognize how many different forms of narratives there are and how they can all be sort of creatively woven into outdoor experiences of any kind.
Mm.
One more, just thinking about it, is service learning trips. So that's also a great story often, if it's done well, if it's done in the right way, that a group of students might go to a location and do something to help the people in that location, or it might be helping the environment in some way, going there to make some positive changes somehow environmentally. And there's that narrative behind the whole thing of what it was like before they went there, what their mission is, what they want to help with, and then seeing the results afterwards, and hopefully following up on it a year later or 2, 3 years later, visiting again and seeing how the positive impact has been made. That is a really strong narrative that, again, motivates, helps people to stay engaged, helps people to see the why of what they're doing, and lastly, helps them to remember it for years to come.
Do you think you had these kind of experiences when you were a kid growing up?
Um,
How
I
were
think
these kind of experiences presented to you?
I mean, I didn't get put on camps in a sort of, my family didn't pay loads of money for me to go on some expensive trip or join some
You think
expense.
Imagine trips are expensive?
I'd say they're pretty fairly priced for the value that one gets from them.
I think they're awesome value, to be honest.
Yeah, some would say probably a little bit too cheap.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
no, my parents didn't really, I think they didn't really feel the need to kind of pay to put me in camps and stuff like that because we had three brothers and my parents were quite sort of outdoorsy themselves and they had quite a lot of spare time in the school holidays because they were teachers as well. So we ended up crafting our own narratives quite often. We would just be out there in the forest, maybe me with my brothers, and we'd just be in the forest all day. And we'd have to think of some narratives to make the day go past. Shenanigans. And we'd start thinking, okay, we are, well, again, like a tribe or something. We'd have to figure out how to, what we wanted to do with our time in the forest as a tribe and what we wanted to make and how we wanted to entertain ourselves and how we wanted to gather resources from around the forest and all this kind of stuff. So I think that's actually where all of this kind of passion came from originally. Because it's even more magical when you create the narratives by yourself, right? When there's not someone telling you to make it. You just naturally, as a kid, you just naturally start making those stories because that's what kids do when they're left to their own devices. And when I say left to their own devices, I don't mean left to their devices, as in smartphones and iPads. Because when they're left to those devices, they are not creating their own stories. They are having the stories shoved down their throats, and that's exactly the opposite.
Yeah, true. It's a huge sap on creativity, isn't it? Just having a really exciting, engaging, screen in front of you that's just telling you what you should be thinking and how you should be playing and things like that, rather than just having that freedom. And I think it is a little bit rarer these days that kids in communities have just free reign to disappear off in the morning and check back in the afternoon.
And I think if you let a bunch of kids just go into the forest, they'd just get their phones out and sit on a tree stump and play on a game, probably on their phone in the forest.
I've noticed that with camps in Taiwan when we have our summer camps. You have kids that are we have a digital detox, so they don't actually, well, it's recommended that they don't bring their phones or iPads and things like that. And at the beginning, they start off, there's an adjustment period, but it's very short. The first days, they might be a little bit naffed out by the experience because they just want to be looking at their iPad. But by day 3, they are suddenly, really galvanized by it and wanting to do things and really excited to go back the next day. We would often leave things the day before, like set a fish trap or something in the river, and then, they cannot wait to get back and check that out. How much more exciting is that than seeing if you've got a new like on one of your photos?
Yeah. I wonder if you, dear listener, have had a similar experience when you're leading a trip, whether you're as a provider or maybe as a school teacher. You may have noticed the same thing, that actually after like 3 days, they're actually completely fine without their phones, because especially if there's a strong narrative, again, because that replaces the narratives that are being pumped at them from their phones. As long as there's that narrative in place, they get into it and they don't really feel the need for looking at their phones anymore after the adjustment period, like you mentioned. I think that's great. It's really nice to see that. So we've covered all kinds of topics to do with narratives and stories in the outdoor world and in outdoor programming. And we could chat forever, I think, Ollie and I, about this kind of stuff, and we often do, but we'll let you go. And if you do you like being called dear listener? Or let me know if you have a preferred address for that. But for now, we'll say dear listener. If you have anything you would like to add to this discussion, please do get in touch and let us know. We're also always on the lookout for guests who are equally fun to talk to and have something interesting to share about the outdoor industry. So let me know if you are one of those people.
Email amp@petetupper.com. That's amp@petetupper.com.
So without further ado, thank you very much, Ollie, for joining us. Always absolute pleasure to catch up.
Been great to chat with you, Pete. Huge fan of the podcast. And I look forward to tuning in for the next one.
Cheers, Ollie. Bye.
Take care. Bye.